Well, good evening, everyone. Last class, which was a few weeks ago, we looked at some prophecies that show to us, or hopefully can prove to ourselves and to others, why God is real, or why we believe God is real and working in our lives. And last class we looked specifically at the Jewish people, didn't we? We looked at them as the fact that they are God's undeniable witness. If you remember, we went to, and actually let's turn there now since we're in Isaiah, come across to Isaiah 43. We looked at this quote here around the nation of Israel and God's witness. So in verse 9 of Isaiah 43, God said, "Let all the nations be gathered together, let the people be assembled." So he brings them all together and all of their gods. "Who among them can declare this and show us former things? Let them bring forth their witness that they may be justified, or let them hear and say it is true." And so he puts this challenge to all of the nations, to the gods of all the nations. What proof have you that you are real? What's your witness? What can you show that you're talking truth? And there was no answer. There was nothing they could show. Verse 10, God said, "Ye are my witness." And he's talking about, as we see in the earlier verses of the chapter, about Abraham and Jacob and Israel. The people of Israel are God's witness. "My servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. I, even I, am Yahweh. Besides me is no Saviour." He labours this point. The whole point of the people of Israel, to an extent, is that they are witnesses to God. They're undeniable that he is real and that he is there. Verse 12, "I have declared and have saved and I have showed, and when there were no strange God among you, therefore ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, that I am God." And then we went on and demonstrated that just how they are God's witness, that almost every aspect of the nation of Israel, every part of their history has been accurately prophesied. Previously, in our current day and in the future, all prophesied, hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years before the events, it was mapped out there of what was to come to pass. Now, the amazing thing is, God didn't just say, "Right, I've laid out Israel, Jerusalem, they're my witness, fantastic, I've done my job. If you don't get it, well, that's too bad. They're a clear witness there for you." No, our loving Heavenly Father is much, much more gracious than this. And there continues to be these key prophecies, these key elements in the Bible, these amazing things that he places in there. So no matter where we turn, there is proof that he is real. There is undeniable proof in the Bible that he is real. He wants all to be saved. And I thought it was worthwhile reminding ourselves of these wonderful quotes there about our God. "Thus say unto them, As I live, saith Yahweh, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but the wicked shall turn from his way and live. Turn ye, for why will you die, O house of Israel?" In Timothy as well. "For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Saviour, who will have all men to be saved and come unto the knowledge of the truth." That is God's plan. It's God's will. Yes, only by his grace and a number respond to that call, but that's not God's intention. That's the hard-heartedness of man. God would that all would be saved. 2 Peter 3, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promises, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance." And so that's, I guess, the framework or the foundation of what we're considering of these classes. God has put real-world signposts in the Bible, and as we'll see, in the world around us, to try and get all men to come to an understanding of God. How they respond to those signposts is obviously up to us and up to individuals, and we'll look at that a bit tonight as well. But the signposts are there. God hasn't hidden himself away. There are very, very clear things. And I was thinking of an example last slide. We see in the life of Christ. He healed thousands of people potentially. Amazing miracles. Raised people from the dead. There were real signs there. There was real obvious things for people to see and to turn to God. And yet they chose to look at, you say you were born in Nazareth and the Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem, therefore you can't be the Messiah. And so how people choose to see Christ was up to them. But there was clear signposts there. And it's the same with God and the Bible with us today. God has made it obvious. Yes, there are a few little things that we have to overcome, and the Bible isn't written as easily as some would say, but there are absolutely clear things, as they were in Christ's life, that show us that God is real. So that's what we want to look at tonight. But specifically, we want to look at another prophecy. It just happens to be in the book of Isaiah, and it was our reading this evening, as Dave said, in Isaiah 45. So let's have a look at that, because here we have another one of these things where God says, "I've put this in place as a signpost that I am real." And we look at verse 1 there again. "Thus saith Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee, to make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass, and cut in sunder the bars of iron. I will give thee the treasures of darkness, and the hidden riches of the secret places." Why? Why is he going to do all this? "That thou mayest know that I, Yahweh, which called thee by thy name, am the God of Israel." And further down there, verse 5, "For I am Yahweh, that there is none else, there is no God beside me. I girded thee, that thou hast not known me." And as a wider than that, verse 6, "That they may know from the rising of the sun from the west, that there is, from the rising sun and from the west, so the whole world, that there is none beside me. I am Yahweh, and there is none else." So that's what we're that's what we're dealing here tonight. God said, "I want to prove to you, to the whole world, from the rising of the sun to the west, that I am Yahweh." And the proof of this is this prophecy about Cyrus. Now, what's so special about these verses? What makes them so special that God says this is one of these signposts? Well, it's a very simple fact. It's not a detailed prophecy. It's not a long prophecy. But it is so specific and so detailed. That's what makes this so amazing and so miraculous. Something that was written, and we'll see, over 150 years beforehand, goes down into specific details. So the miraculous thing about last class with the nation of Israel was just the enormity of it, in a sense. It spanned thousands of years. It spanned whole nations. It expanded sort of the wane and the fall, and even in that in itself was miraculous, that God could control nations over thousands of years and make all these mighty things happen. Here, he almost then goes to that's the macro level, and now he's going to zoom right down almost to the micro level and say, do you know what? As miraculous as that is, I also control the individual and the little things in life. And do you know what? He says, I can be very specific as well as these broad things. And so he says, I'm going to say that in 150 years, and we'll look at the timings, there's going to be a person who's going to be born, he's going to be a king, and his name is going to be Cyrus. And even more than that, look in the chapter before, verse 28, he goes into even more specific here. Thus he saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, or saying regarding Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. So over 100 years before, he said there's going to be a specific king, he's going to have this specific name, he will look at this specific city in the whole world, and then of that city he will choose this specific building, and he will rebuild it. You could not get more specific over that length of time than what we have here. It's not like we have the horoscopes that we read, embrace the change that comes. Well, what does that mean? Is it change of clothes, change of country? Embrace it. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it in 5 years? Is it in 5 minutes? That don't mean anything. But here, this is specific. And that's the power that we see in this verse. And that's exactly, so God laid it out there for everyone to see. And it came true. That's the other thing. We don't even have to spend any time proving, was there a person called Cyrus? Was he a king? His stamp is all throughout history. It's undeniable. He was a king of the world, the Medes, the Persians. Archaeology, through any way you look at it, undeniable that there was a man called Cyrus that did exactly what God prophesied. So that's the other side of it, the undeniable prophecy. So God says, here, if you want a proof that I'm God, look at this prophecy. Now, because it is such an undeniably fulfilled prophecy, people don't spend time trying to disprove that there was a person called Cyrus, because it's impossible. So instead they say, well, it must be the other end. There must be something about this book of Isaiah, something that it's written that could make this happen. There's no way that this could happen. We can't look at that and say this is God's thing. We can't possibly have that as a solution. So what's the other solution? Well, Isaiah must have been written after Cyrus was born. That's the only human explanation here of this. And so rather than spend time tonight trying to prove the prophecy, which we normally do, we don't have to do that tonight. What I want to spend time is shoring up our foundation around this prophecy and around the timings of Isaiah and the authorship of Isaiah, so that we can be very, very sure in this firm signpost that this was written when it said it was written, by whom it was written, and therefore is an undeniable fact about the proof and existence of God. You see, when people see signs about God, they react in numerous ways, and here's another one. I thought I'd just put on the screen Romans 1, and I thought this was applicable because it mentions about, in our reading tonight as well, about creation and what God had done. So Romans 1 talks about another clear signpost that God is real, and that's the creation around us. God says because the invisible attributes of God are difficult to see, he made them visible through creation, so that no man is without excuse. In these first verses I have there, well, verse 20, I'll read that. For his invisible attributes, namely his internal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So there's our third, signpost or fundamental pillar of faith. We have Israel, we have prophecy, and specifically Cyrus, and we have creation. These are so people without excuse, no matter where you look, their God is showing and revealing himself. But people don't want to accept this. And so, as I said, it depends how they view these things. Just as the people viewed Christ of their day, they choose to slant these things. And this is what we saw, verse 21. For although they knew God, they did not honour him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So in Paul's day, in the Roman days, they worshipped all manner of animal idols and gave the glory to the animal idols. In our day today, we see it in Taoism and evolutionary science, and they give all the credit to the animals and the way they evolved. I mean, if you ever watch a David Attenborough documentary, it's amazing, isn't it? It's this bird is just so amazing how it's evolved to know how to do this, and this creature here is fantastic. It's a wonderful creature, and they worship the creature rather than the Creator. And so that's how they react, and that's exactly what we're going to see tonight that people do around Isaiah. This quote here in Cyrus, when presented with undeniable fact, they try and twist things and change things. And so, as we said, we want to shore up our foundation so that we can be confident in ourselves that this does stand up to scrutiny and to scepticism. So come across to Isaiah chapter 1, because we want to say, well, when was Isaiah written? Was it written before the time of Cyrus? So let's start. What does Isaiah say? Verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 1. The vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Isaiah, Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Couldn't get a more specific timing here. There's no ambiguity about who wrote this or when he wrote it or where he wrote it. It's spelled out perfectly and beautifully for us. So he says, look, I wrote in the time of the reign of these kings. So if we can prove that these kings existed and when they wrote and when they lived, we have some provable facts around the fact that if this is right, we have some time frame of when Isaiah was written. So I have here a screenshot of this is regarded as the definitive work on the chronological of the Hebrew kings. Okay, 1951 it was written, but it's still even today in profane history and by the so-called experts, they say this book is pretty much proves more often than not to align with archaeology around the chronological of the kings. So here we have, as you can see up there, the evidence of the timeline of when these kings that Isaiah talks about were here. So starting from Isaiah 792, obviously this is BC, so it goes backwards to 687 there, Hezekiah is this time frame. Now, as I say there, archaeological evidence, which is plenty of it, show that Cyrus died in 530 BC until was born around 600 BC. So we've got there the latest, even if he wrote the day that Hezekiah died or around that year there, it's still a minimum of 87 years before Cyrus was even born. But more likely, as you said, around 100 and 150 years between Isaiah 45 and the birth of Cyrus. So plenty of room for margin of error and all of those things to be very sure based on just this time frame, this well-regarded timeline backed up by so far archaeological evidence around that there was well written before the time. These kings existed before the time of Cyrus. Can we dig a little bit deeper than that? Okay, that's what this work says, this body of work says, but what about outside of this? Are there any external archaeological information or proof around that can back up these time frames of these kings? And there's lots around, but I've picked some of the more credible ones that are widely available and accessible here as well for us today. So this is... I've changed my headings up here, but so it's hidden, but it's around, King Ahaz, okay? So here is a seal. It's, I think, in the British Museum at the time. It contains the name of King Ahaz. It calls his father, and it specifically calls him the king of Judah. So we know that this king was alive and existed, just as Isaiah prophesied, just as Isaiah said, and there's the translation. So we know that these kings existed, that they were actually real, and the time frame that they existed in. We continue on. I can't edit it. Sorry, I'm missing that. This is Nimrod's tablet. Once again, a bit difficult to see there in the sun, but once again, it's in many famous museums. I think it's in the British Museum at the moment, but has been in others. But it's a clay tablet dated 733 from the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, which is the Assyrian kings were very detailed in their record, so it's very easy to date the kings and to have that accurately done. So we can see 733, which is before 600 when Cyrus was born. Going on there, it basically, down the bottom, it talks about saying that it received tribute from King Ahaz, or Jehoiahaz, which his name is, of Judah, consisting gold, silver, etc. And it's one of the first, it's quite famous because it's one of the very first inscriptions mentioning the kingdom of Judah by name. And so here we have a clay tablet, external archaeological proof that there was a king called King Ahaz, and that he existed in time that we said around the 700 to 730 BC, well before the time of Cyrus. So we could start to click this together and have confidence that these kings existed and in the timeline before Cyrus. This is the prism. I've got the name of the prism. It's up there, but it's hidden. That meant, oh, there you go, Taylor Prism, dated 700 BC. Once again, externally dated from other references to the kings in it. As for Hezekiah, the Judea, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his fortified cities, etc. Went and did all that and counted them as booty and went off with all of this booty from Hezekiah's time. So we have external, as the king came back, external evidence and dating to show that these kings existed and that they existed before the time of Cyrus. And Isaiah says, I prophesied, I wrote in the times of these kings. Okay, so that's just some sort of external proof around that these kings existed, as I said, and that they were born before. So we can have confidence that Isaiah was written existed, and he was written in the time frames that he's stated, which is before the times of Cyrus. So people say, okay, well that's fine. That's a good point. So you've proven these kings existed. You've proven that Isaiah wrote in these times before Cyrus. Okay, well then maybe Isaiah didn't write the whole book. Maybe there's two writers. Maybe there is one that wrote in this time as you talk about, and then another Isaiah that maybe a ghost writer or someone like that penned the second half of the book after Cyrus and Babylon and those sort of things. And that is, I guess you would call it the more popular view of Isaiah today. Most secular people or people that use the biblical record as a history book, or even those that don't believe in the infallibility of Isaiah, suggest that there's two authors to Isaiah. That the Isaiah that we've talked about, that wrote in the times of these kings, wrote from chapters 1 to chapter 39, and then from chapter 40 onwards was written by an unknown scribe who lived in Babylon at the time of Cyrus, and therefore he could write very accurately about Cyrus and the prophecies, and that's how it happened. So that's sort of, I guess, the continue down this path of refusing to acknowledge the wonder of God. So I think, okay, well that's fine. We can continue down with this as well, where we believe in the Bible, we believe in the authenticity of the Bible, so we should have some answers for this argument as well. And we do, despite, I think, I find it a difficult article, clutching at straws to try and sort of prove so. Some of their reasonings are, maybe there's some changes in the way that it's written, and some of the phrases seem different in the second part. Now, I'm no linguistic expert, so I'm not even going to go into any of those proofs. Really, the bottom line is they can come up with any proof that they want, so-called. The fundamental reason is they don't want there to be only one author, because it means that God is real and they have to believe that. So they'll come up with all reasons. But what we need to look at is, why can we be confident that there is only one author in the book of Isaiah, and it was written when we said. So there's a couple of things after looking into this that I thought was worth sharing around that. And I think one of the most important ones is the harmony throughout the Bible, which we know, and we love the Bible and we see it there all the time. So it bears a lot of weight for us in our own community. But when we look at the New Testament, and I have got it here, a list here, these are all the times that the New Testament quotes the book of Isaiah and specifically attributes it to an author called Isaiah. And all of these quotes, as we say here, on the side there, from Isaiah 1 right through to Isaiah 65, are all contributed to one single person called the prophet Isaiah, or Isaiah the son of Amos, or what have you. There was no inclination whatsoever in the early first century that there was any reference to two authors, or, hey, only, when you quote Isaiah, only quote the first 39 books. Absolutely not. In fact, it even gets further than that. Not just do they quote Isaiah there, but in some of the ones, in John 12, in verses 38 to 41, he quotes from Isaiah 53 verse 1 and Isaiah 6 in the same sentence, and joins them together and calls it written as Isaiah quoted in John 12. In Matthew 3 verse 3, he quotes Isaiah 40. As I said, the second half there. And we've got some more. In fact, even Jesus himself quotes and says, this as is written by Isaiah, and joins the two together. So there we have, I think, some really strong reasonings, and we can see there's a whole list there for ourselves, from the Gospels right into Romans, where these writers quote extensively from Isaiah, both half, front and back half, and quote him by name. But it even goes back even earlier than the Gospel writers. If we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the believed to be being the earliest copy of Isaiah that we have, towards the 2nd century, so only about 300 years after the Jews were exiled to Babylon, so relatively newish, relatively short period of time, 300 years, we have then the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's no indication in this, looking at them firsthand, that there is a divide in the prophecy. In fact, I looked into this a bit more, and you can even go online and look at actual real copies or photographs of the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah 39 and Isaiah 40 actually start on the same line as each other. So once again, you can't really see it, but where that red line is where Isaiah 39 ends, and Isaiah 40, which is supposed to be a whole new book written by another whole person, start on the same line as each other. There's no visible difference here in it whatsoever. And there's a quote here by Dr. Peter Flynn, who's one of the editors who worked on the actual original copies of the Dead Sea Scroll and the book of Isaiah. He says here, I'll read because it just cuts off a bit, but many scholastic studies tell us that the book of Isaiah was divided into two parts. First Isaiah by the Isaiah in Jerusalem, chapter 1 to 39, and second Isaiah by a writer living after the Hebrews. So as he's saying, that's the common view today. As a reaction to these kind of studies, many people ask the question of me, is there a division in the great Isaiah scroll between the chapters, la la la? And the answer is no. There is no division at that point. So here is someone here who's studied the actual scrolls, and the very few people who's viewed the actual original document. He's aware of the situation, and he's looked at it very carefully and said, look, I've looked at that and there is no visible inclination either on the line or in writing or the way that it's written that there's any division there whatsoever. So I think that's a fairly significant point around that. But let's consider for a minute that, okay, let's say there are two authors of the book of Isaiah. Let's say that Isaiah 1 to 39 is written by Isaiah in Jerusalem and Isaiah 40 onwards by someone in Scribes. Even if that were the case, it's not like there's no prophecy in the first half of Isaiah and all the prophecies in the second half and therefore make sense. Here's my case in point. Come across to chapter 13 of Isaiah. And so it's such a ridiculous argument that people propose this two authorship thing to try and get around this verse that we're talking about. As I said, such a small verse, but the power and weight that the people will try and weasel their way out of these verses. But Isaiah chapter 13, and if we look at verse 1, there's no doubt here about who wrote this book there. You see it written by Isaiah, son of Amos, very specifically, no doubt in this chapter. But look down at verse 17. Behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver, no delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men, they'll have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. No, their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendour and pomp of the Chaldees, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. Verse 20, it will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherd will make their flocks lie down there, and etc. And he goes on about how desolate it will be. So here in supposedly the first half of Isaiah that is, to have no prophecy whatever, he accurately predicts that the Medes will destroy Babylon and that the city there will be desolate forever today. In fact, he even mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. So here we have the two here. Now, I was going to ask if anyone knows which one's Sodom and Gomorrah and which one's Babylon, but I myself have actually forgotten, so it's not much help. But I think that's Sodom and Gomorrah over there, and the closest one here is Babylon. But the point is, and they don't even know where Sodom and Gomorrah is really, that's how desolate it is. But that's the point, that it's completely destroyed. It will never be inhabited and lived in for all generations. So what did the Babylonian scribe quickly nip over and write chapter 13 and slot that into the page? It doesn't make sense. So the book of Isaiah is jammed full of prophecy. Chapter 7, you've got the Emmanuel prophecy, and then he goes on to talk about all the various things that would happen to Ahaz and the kings before him. Isaiah 8, he talks about what would happen to Damascus and the prophecy around there. Isaiah 39, he talks about Hezekiah itself and the fact that his sons would be taken off into captivity and so on. There's prophecy all throughout the whole book of Isaiah. So even trying to split the book up into dual authors does nothing to remove the divine hand of God in the book. There's one other proof I think that and then there's many more we could look at, but one other proof that I think is very powerful as I said, we didn't go into linguistics and style of writings and all of that because, as I said, we don't really have any proof around that, and none of us are experts. But simple things like this, I think, hold a lot of weight. Another one of those is the fact that the so-called the second half of the book is when they were in Babylon and afterwards. Now, some of you may know that books that are written after the captivity, after the nation returned out of Babylon, such as Haggai, Malachi, Ezra, Nehemiah, they contain no mention of idolatry very much at all. Before that, yes, lots of mention of idolatry. It was a real issue for the people, and all the books written before that decry them and tell them to turn away from idols. Books after don't have really any mention of idolatry. It's like the people were sick of idolatry, but the problem was gone out of their lives when they came back from Babylon, and it was other problems. But that's not the case when you look at the book of Isaiah. All throughout Isaiah, first and second part, are consistent messages and warnings telling the people to stay away from idols, to not fall into the trap of following the idols around them. For those that want the mention, there's a few key mentions in the second half. Isaiah 44 verse 9, Isaiah 57 verse 4 and 5, and Isaiah 65 verse 2 and 4. So 3 or 4, even I think there's 5 instances in the second half of Isaiah that all talk about and warn the people to turn away from idols. We just don't see that in any other book of the nation once they're out of captivity. So even if you do start to look into these linguistic differences and things like that, even then there's some very really key proofs that we can say that no, Isaiah was written when it says it was written, it stacks up, it's a fundamental pillar of our faith. But I didn't want to sort of end on a negative type sort of thing of trying to disprove all of this stuff. So let's come back. Oh, actually, I think I've got it here. Isaiah 45, the bit we looked at. Let's look at the power of this prophecy. He says there, so we know that Cyrus existed, but what are some of the things it talks about as far as the taking of the Babylon and the fulfilment of this prophecy? So thus saith Yahweh to his anointed Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. I will loose the loins of kings, to open him the 2 levered gates, and the gates thereof shall not be shut. I will go before thee, I'll make the crooked place straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass, and cut in sunder the bars of iron. I will give thee these treasures of darkness, and the hidden riches of secret places. And so not only is this prophecy very specific in name and in person, but it's quite specific in how this person would rise to power and his conquest, and particularly in the context of Babylon. It's not about war and destruction and going out and smashing these forces, is it? God's saying, I will open the gates, I will allow this to happen, I will walk you in to your position of authority and power. And I thought it's worth, even as a cementing our faith in this regards, about even the fulfilment of this prophecy. And so I've just got I think it goes for about 10-minute clip on a professor talking about the archaeology and the reasonings and what we know about the captivity of Babylon and Cyrus's role that he played in that. And we'll see it answers exactly to the verses that we see here. And so I'll just put this on. We can have a look at we'll talk about the clip itself afterwards, because it's an interesting. Some of the things that he mentions are quite interesting. Obviously, this isn't a believer, even though he uses the Bible as a tool. It's very clear he doesn't believe in the infallibility of it.
My name is David Vanderhoeft. I'm an associate professor of Hebrew Bible at Boston College in Newton, Massachusetts. So at the end of native rule in Babylonia, the city was ruled by a combination of King Nabonidus and his son, Belshazzar, known also from the biblical stories, for example, who were sympathetic to Marduk, who had long been the patron deity of the Babylonian dynasty, felt betrayed. Nabonidus also was curious in another way. He left Babylon for a substantial portion of the last decade of his reign to live in the northern Arabian desert at Tema, where he went about worshipping, again, his moon god Sin. Belshazzar is said to have been left behind in Babylon as regent. During these years, the conflict may well have risen to a kind of head. In any case, we know that in 539, native Babylonian rule was put to an end when Cyrus decides to take advantage of the turmoil in Babylon and invade the city. We learn then that the elite Babylonians welcomed Cyrus, at least some of them, into the city as a kind of liberator. The famous document known as the Cyrus Cylinder, discovered in Babylon in 1879, lists the benefactions that Cyrus brings to Babylon, but of course the document is written in Babylonian by sympathetic Babylonian scribes. A few of the things stand out in this Cyrus Cylinder that deserve mention. Cyrus himself, according to the text, claims that it was the Babylonian god Marduk who welcomed him into his role. So, for example, we read that Marduk surveyed and looked throughout all the lands, searching for a righteous king who he would support. He called out his name, Cyrus, king of Anshan. He pronounced his name to be king over all the world. This echoes, of course, surprisingly, the language of the so-called second Isaiah in chapter 45 and elsewhere, including 48 of Isaiah, who likewise understood Cyrus as a kind of liberator figure, the only king in the Messianic, to be ascribed the Messianic title, Mashiach, in the Judean tradition, who wasn't a native Judean. Later in the Cyrus Cylinder, Cyrus then speaks about the great benefactions he performed for Babylon and the joy that this brought to the high god Marduk. I'll read a section of this text, lines 22 and following. When I entered Babylon in a peaceful manner, I took up my lordly reign in the royal palace amidst rejoicing and happiness. Marduk, the great lord, caused the people of Babylon to rejoice. I daily attended to his worship. My vast army moved about in Babylon in peace. I didn't permit anyone to frighten the people of Sumer and Akkad, the traditional names for Babylonia. I sought the welfare of the city of Babylon and all its sacred centers. As for the citizens of Babylon, upon whom he, that is, the predecessor Nabonidus, the wicked king, had imposed corvée, tax duties, which was against the God's will and not benefiting them, I relieved their weariness and freed them from their service. Marduk, the great lord, rejoiced over my good deeds. He sent gracious blessings upon me, Cyrus, the king, who worships him, and also upon Cambyses, the son who is my offspring, and upon all my army, and in peace before him we move about. So one can hear then the Babylonian scribes speaking in support of Cyrus, and Cyrus claiming to be nothing but an agent of Marduk and a peaceful denizen of Babylon. Was this the case? We know quite a bit about the details of Cyrus entering into Babylon and taking up reign there in the autumn of 539 BCE. The Greek historians, some fragmentary biblical references, and also other Babylonian texts tell us about his entry into the city. Not all details are clear, but we see that shortly after Cyrus's arrival in the city, the cuneiform scribes began to date their documents according to the reign of Cyrus, for example. Word had spread quickly, within a week, that new documents should be penned in the first year of Cyrus. Now, the tradition historiographically about how he entered the city is interesting. As the Cyrus Cylinder says, he came into the city in peace. His army was completely passive and didn't upset the local order. Cyrus later says that he took great care to observe the cult of Marduk in Babylon and didn't even let his soldiers march around in the city. We learn from 2nd Isaiah that he was likewise a foreseen liberator, of course, in that case for the Judeans, not for the Babylonians. We learn later on from Herodotus, the Greek historian, and Xenophon, that Cyrus was a kind of enlightened leader, that his entry into Babylon was a kind of end product of an enlightened rule, not a kind of despotism. How much do all of these views withstand scrutiny? It's probable that Babylon was not destroyed. Certainly, we have no archaeological record of the city having been leveled, razed, or otherwise decimated in the time of Cyrus's arrival. So it would seem that the accounts in the cuneiform, biblical, and Greek records accord with, at a certain level, the claims of Cyrus, that he came into the city in peace. And yet, the Greeks, and maybe even the Babylonians and the Judeans, recognized that there was something in Cyrus's achievement that might have involved a military stratagem. Herodotus and Xenophon suggest that since this was the autumn, and since the Euphrates was at its lowest level, Cyrus used a kind of hydrological stratagem to make his entry into the city. He went north and diverted the course of the Euphrates into the west to the region around Borsippa, and sent his troops in while the Babylonians were celebrating a festival through the lowered, empty channel of the Euphrates, where they snuck under the fortifications and surprised the Babylonians in their city. Now, we don't have any affirmation that this, in fact, took place in Babylon. We don't have any cuneiform tablets that speak to this. We only know this claim that he entered peacefully. Does this statement that he entered peacefully subsume a kind of military approach? It's at least possible, because from the Babylonian tradition, the idea that Cyrus would be an invader, a conqueror of Babylon, was seen as unacceptable. The last major invasion of Babylon by an outsider, which resulted in its destruction, was by King Sennacherib of Assyria in 689, which resulted in the complete devastation of Babylon. So there's a good chance that the Babylonian historiographers are not interested in presenting Cyrus as an intelligent and wise general who, through some kind of stratagem, entered the city. Rather, they emphasize his pious allegiance to the Babylonian god. The Greeks, by contrast, have a good reason for their presentation of Cyrus as a kind of military genius. He becomes for them a kind of antithesis to the older model of Near Eastern rule, and becomes a kind of exemplar of enlightened royal kingship for the Westerners looking to Persia. So we can see in each of the traditions, and possibly also even in the Judean one, in Jeremiah, chapters 50 to 51, which are a series of oracles against Babylon, but seem to have some indications of how Babylon fell, and might even recognize that there was a military component in that fall. We can see in all of these traditions local reasons for the presentation of Cyrus's achievement in Babylon. In other words, the transition from Mesopotamian rule in Babylon in 539 to Persian rule was something that historiographers across the Near East worry about. Cyrus seems to have had a very deep influence on all of these traditions. Each of them then takes the opportunity to represent their highest ideals for kingship and for pacific rule of a great city by placing their interpretation of Cyrus's entry into Babylon in the best possible light. Cyrus never comes off as a conqueror, always, in all the traditions, as a kind of liberator. Was he? Did all Babylonians see him this way? We don't know. Probably some were opposed to the rule of a king from outside. But their records don't survive. What we do know is that in the Cyrus Cylinder, Cyrus proclaims that the gods of Babylon, who had had to flee from their temples under the rule of his predecessor Nabonidus, were allowed to return, and all was made right in the country. So Cyrus becomes, in legend and in the historiographic traditions, the great liberator of Babylon, not its conqueror. Surprisingly, though, it's Cyrus himself at that very time, using Babylonian idioms, using Babylonian texts, and using the scribal services of the Babylonians, who puts an end to the tradition of native Mesopotamian rule in Babylon, which will never rise again, and within a few centuries will dissipate into the world of the Greeks and Alexander.
Yeah, so that is the professor of Bible presenting their view on the destruction of Babylon. And it's very wishy-washy, as they all tend to be. They never want to take a firm position. But the point he's saying is, whichever way you look at it, as the victor writes the history, it wasn't some big destruction and mighty military act, but rather either through stealth or even through the people actually even opening the gates for him to come in. The conquest of Babylon is exactly as God prophesied as how Cyrus would come to power through opening up and allowing him to happen. As I mentioned, there's a few interesting things. He talks about this second Isaiah. So he's a believer in one of these believers that there was two Isaiahs in the book. But I thought it was interesting he mentions about, without even really knowing it, that just dropping as a line that in what we read this evening in Isaiah 45 talks about Cyrus as the Messiah, one of the only few references to Cyrus as the Messiah, which we know sets up this wonderful parallel that is in the book of Isaiah around Cyrus and the type that he is to Christ. So even he picked up on that, but without really understanding the power of what that was. And then his final comment there at the end was interesting, wasn't it? Saying that Babylon from then on was destroyed, never to be raised again, and then would be swallowed up into the power of the Greeks and the Romans, exactly as foretold by Daniel's image and the prophecies in our Daniel, exactly as we believe and is laid out in history. So no matter which side of history you look on, these prophecies were fulfilled exactly as God fulfilled it, prophesied it to be through the hand of Isaiah. So that's time there for us tonight. But hopefully, God willing, we've seen again another signpost there of God's wonderful, clearly indicated reasons and pillars of our faith to believe that He is real, whether it's on a global scale through the nation of Israel, as we saw last time, or whether it's down to individual people and operating all these things in individual lives. God's hand is there. His angels are there. And just as He's working, as we said last week, for the thousands of angels as they're working to fulfill these prophecies, these same angels are working as individuals in our lives as well. And we can have confidence that the God that we believe is real.